Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
When I broke the news 2 weeks ago about Dr. Laura Anderson's multiple violations against the AAMFT Code of Ethics, I figured more would come out as others began looking into the story, especially other therapists. 4 days later, on Friday night of the week my article dropped, Anderson wrote an apology. Anderson wrote, "I am not a perfect person. I have made mistakes. I have fumbled in friendships. I have said things I regret. And when those things are removed from their emotional and relational context, they can appear far worse than they were ever intended to be. Still, impact matters, and if I caused harm, when I caused harm, even unintentionally, I care deeply about that. I am truly sorry." But many people weren't buying it. As Stephanie Jo Warren wrote, quote, "What followed a brief apology was not so much accountability as it was an explanation, one that will be familiar to anyone raised in evangelical culture. Within the evangelical movement, the skill of avoiding responsibility is almost like a fundamental doctrine. By preschool, many cradle Christians have already internalized the formula. I'm not perfect. I make mistakes. With age, it matures into something more polished. We are all fallen people. These are not apologies. They are deflections wrapped in theological language, rhetorical fog used to evade clarity. Rarely do they arrive at the plain, necessary truth. I was wrong. I caused harm. Here is how I am making it right." Framing one's apology as a reflection on how personal strengths became personal weaknesses is not an act of contrition. It is a narrative device. It shifts the focus away from the harm done and onto the supposed complexity of the person who caused it. It does not reckon, it explains. And in doing so, it sidesteps the very core of accountability, unquote. But besides people analyzing her apology, the story has evolved over the past 2 weeks as people have discovered more, not simply from testimony against her, as I shared in my piece, but from her very own book. Here's a popular podcaster named The Knitting Cult Lady explaining it on her YouTube channel.
All right, then we have the Laura Anderson ethics complaint. Some of you who've been around for a long time may remember that I was reading a book about religious trauma and then abruptly stopped reading it, and that's because I was told that Dr. Laura Anderson was quite toxic and acting like a cult leader herself. Let's see. Some big and disturbing news in the deconstruction community. Dr. Laura Anderson has been sanctioned by the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. Some people are suspicious of the fact that the only news outlet to discuss it is Baptist News Global, and that's understandable. Certainly people who have been critical of religious institutions have been targeted by religious news defenders. So while the skepticism is good, especially by those who've been intimidated or silenced by religious institutions, we have it on good authority that the witnesses who filed complaints against Dr. Anderson had good reason to do so. I was personally contacted by someone who I have every reason to trust and told this stuff years ago. In fact, when this complaint came out, it was the least surprising thing I have ever seen. We also want to draw attention to a clear instance of Dr. Anderson engaged in predatory grooming that she describes in her own book, beginning on page 17. While intending to draw a picture of a church interfering with her personal life, she instead reveals that as an adult she had a romantic interest in a boy who was still in high school and 4 years younger than her. This was, of course, just one of several red flags. There is an article that we will tag in the notes, the whole article about this going on, if you have been following her. It's just something that I want the deconstruction community to know. It's a big deal when a therapist is actually sanctioned, and just because the only reason that we don't know all the details is to save the people who have complained.
This storyline about Anderson's romantic involvement with a teenager was first called out by a therapist named Crispin Mayfield, who wrote on Instagram, quote, "What do you do with the work of our creator that you discover has been unethical, coercive, or abusive?" After the Baptist News Global article by Rick Pidcock about Laura Anderson's ethical violations and intimidating behavior, people have been asking me how they should approach her book. I believe that's for individuals to decide. Let's get away from authoritarianism. For me, I've never recommended her book because the first chapter includes a story about beginning a romantic relationship with a high schooler when she was 4 years older. I know she says she didn't start the relationship until after he was graduated, but clearly there was a romantic element prior, which at best felt out of place in a book about religious trauma, unquote. Stephanie Jo Warren added in her piece, quote, "What's most disturbing is that Anderson never names this for what it was. She never expresses remorse, never acknowledges the profound ethical violation of even entertaining a romantic relationship with a student. Instead, she centers her own feelings, how hurt she was by the youth pastor's reaction, how humiliated she felt to be removed from her role. Here's the thing, he was doing his job. He did what we beg pastors to do. He protected the young people in his care from someone inappropriately fixated on a teenager." Then Warren directly addresses Anderson, saying, "Laura, you have built a public platform around the language of spiritual harm and religious trauma. You have called others to accountability, but in this moment, in these few pages before your book even begins, you ask us to empathize with behavior that would be disqualifying in anyone else. If the roles were reversed, no one would hesitate to call it what it is: predatory. This isn't a gray area. This isn't a misunderstood moment. This is a clear failure of judgment, responsibility, and ethical leadership. You owed your readers transparency. You owed your audience, especially those who have survived church-based abuse, a real reckoning. Not emotional manipulation, not silence, and certainly not a weaponized narrative designed to win sympathy and avoid accountability. Laura, your behavior is the reason why many people distrust youth leaders and pastors. It's also why I refuse to let my children attend youth groups. Your actions are exactly what I work hard to protect my children from every day. You should not have been in that role, and your pastor was right to remove you from it," unquote. So one of the takeaways I'm noticing here is how unsettling the story is. Not simply because of the scandal I wrote about, or even the fallout since then, but due to how it messes with our assumptions about who to trust. For example, we're very aware of the abuse scandals in the church, especially in the Southern Baptist Convention. These are stories that Baptist News Global has covered for years. And for some of us who have been so hurt by religious trauma, we can't even imagine trusting a pastor again. So, in our healing process, we may talk with a therapist or a religious trauma coach. But then the Anderson story comes out, where we learn that even the religious trauma expert who has left Christianity is abusing people. And it's being reported by a Baptist news organization. So, ex-evangelicals, who have all the reason in the world to be cautious around Baptists given their experience of abuse in Southern Baptist churches, end up having to trust the reporting of a Baptist news organization. Then people who processed their abuse by following Laura Anderson have to deal with the fact that the youth pastor was the one protecting the kids, while the future ex-evangelical religious trauma expert was the one harming the kids. You can see how people who have the weight of religious trauma on them are having a lot of assumptions about who they can trust and who is looking out for them kind of turned on their heads here, and they're having to process all of this. You can imagine how disorienting this might be for people. Who do we trust? Do we now trust youth pastors? Do we now trust Baptists? Are there different kinds of Baptists where some are trustworthy and some are not? Do we not trust therapists? How did Anderson's book get so popular without therapists calling it out for the grooming story in the very beginning of her book? These are all legitimate questions that people have to process through. And while I'm thankful that my story is helping people be more aware of how they might be harmed, even in the world of ex-evangelical therapy or religious trauma coaching, I don't want people to be so caught in their fear that they don't seek the help they need because they don't know where to turn. So, to help us get some clarity on the options we have for healing, I sat down to talk with Emily Maynard, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist in California. So to start off with, what is religious trauma? And is there something unique about religious trauma that others who grew up outside of religion might not understand? I'm just curious why we set aside religious trauma as opposed to trauma, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would say in my work, I see religious trauma as a subset of trauma. It's a specific type of trauma, the same way that we would talk about childhood abuse trauma. We would talk about maybe veteran trauma, maybe sexual assault trauma. It's just sort of an adjective that we use to describe what type of trauma are we talking about. Because it is pretty different to have a relational trauma of, say, growing up with a parent who is actively using substances and the chaos that that can cause in a family versus, say, a car accident. Those are both trauma because they have specific formulaic types of impacts on people's lives, relationships, mental health, um, kind of sense of themselves. But the cause is very different. And therefore, some of the nuances around religious trauma are going to be related to your religious upbringing, your sense of identity, your sense of God or a divine being, and certainly your relationships, social, family, church, that kind of stuff.
Yes. Or like impending end times that might happen at any moment or end of life stuff. There's a lot of panic that
Yeah.
can come with that.
Yeah, a lot of theological impacts that last, even when people can shift mentally out of a space that's harmful to them. A lot of those things tend to stick around.
Yes. So, for the person who has experienced religious trauma, what are some feelings that they may be processing as they're kind of privately considering whether they want to seek professional help?
Yeah, I think that it's important to remember that people have agency and that there are lots of different ways to heal. I know that the traditional medical system, the insurance system, even the cost of psychotherapy can be really prohibitive. And people have been healing and growing and learning and changing outside of the sort of Western white power focused psychotherapy systems that developed from the line of Freud. So I want to hold both things. I think therapy is really powerful and important and can be a significant support to healing. That's my whole work. But I also want to acknowledge that some people don't have access to it right now. I think books are a really helpful way to heal. Reading a little bit about trauma can certainly be helpful. But I think there's also a lot of information that we get from our religious upbringing that compounds religious trauma and unlearning a lot of that, whether that's deconstructing the, white supremacy that maybe you were raised with in Christianity or the sense of patriarchy and hierarchies. All of that work is a part of healing personal trauma as well. So therapy is something that's really specific, but I know that it's not the only thing that heals, but it is, comes from a long history of training. The science of it has continued to advance, as well as the practice and kind of relational aspect of psychotherapy has continued to advance. And that's something that I think is worth trusting in certain circumstances.
Yeah, that's helpful. So, like, one of the options I've heard people say besides therapy is coaching. And some
Mhm.
people even offer, they'll say, we offer therapy, but we also offer religious trauma coaching. What's the difference between a therapist and a coach?
So, to me, I am a therapist. I am not a coach. So, I'm not going to speak for all coaches, but I know what's distinct about psychotherapy is a specific informed consent. So, informed consent is what you, as the client or the patient, are agreeing to when you're joining a therapeutic relationship or even a coaching relationship. And what that means is it's going to define the scope of treatment. What can I help with? What do I not help with? When am I available? When am I not available? What kinds of topics are we going to consider? And also part of informed consent is saying, like, how am I going to help you? What's my training? What's my theory of this work? What are we going to do together that's actually going to make a difference in your life? So, psychotherapy is regulated by each state, and there is a definition of therapy in each state. And someone, in order to practice therapy, is going to need to be licensed in that state or have some sort of recognition. Maybe they're just registered in a state, but there's going to be something official. You can go to every single state's website and find their counselor lookup or therapist lookup and find that person's name in that system. And then anything else, unregulated activity is going to be something like coaching. So I think what's important in coaching is that there's a really clear distinction of what are you working on and how are you going to work on it. And it cannot be the same thing that you would be doing in psychotherapy. Otherwise, that's unlicensed clinical activity, basically. And you, as a consumer, obviously can choose to consent to something, but if someone is already blurring the lines between like, oh, therapy and coaching are basically just the same thing, they're already in violation of a legal statute and the training of psychotherapy. So I think coaching is really helpful for very specific things. For example, people with eating disorders often benefit from having some sort of food or nutrition coach to help keep them on track with their behaviors, maybe while they're also doing psychotherapy to understand some of the impacts and some of the causes related to that eating disorder. So, in my mind, I think it's very hard to be a religious trauma coach because trauma is something that is sort of known to be a psychotherapy activity. And I think it is I don't know, I don't personally like blurring those lines very much. I would rather encourage people to see someone who is licensed and trained as a psychotherapist if they're going to be doing trauma work. But again, I know there's other takes on that. My preference is always just to, especially because as religious trauma survivors, we're people who've been impacted by abuses of power, to stay very far away from anyone who's already blurring boundaries or could potentially be in a position of authority over you where you have very little legal or ethical recourse if someone were to violate um, kind of the standards of practice. So, coaching for ADHD executive function, if you are trying to organize your life or maybe your school system structure a little bit better, super awesome. If it's clinical work, if it's talking about diagnosing or treating things that are commonly mental health diagnoses, then I'm a little bit more concerned about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know, like, I've never actually personally seen a therapist, but a big part of my transition in life, theologically and spiritually, happened with what you could consider to be like a coach introducing me to like some basic self-awareness, where I started to get to know my personal life story. But I would like that was a good starting point for me to think about some of those
Mhm.
things, but that would be different than actually seeing a medical professional.
Right. So coaching is just a more limited scope, and it should, often it has like, hey, you're paying for 6 sessions and we're working on this specific project together, and you're going to get this kind of support, and anything else that comes up, we're not really going to address. Whereas therapy is much more open. I'm trained in all sorts of different types of things that can come up in a person's life, and I have specialized training in more of them, but I am qualified to be able to diagnose generally anything in the DSM
Yeah.
or to provide treatment or provide referrals for treatment, depending on the case.
Okay. So I've noticed a lot of therapists and coaches are on social media these days, and which introduces the idea of building a platform, and many of them are authors as well.
Mhm.
And so, like, on one hand, it's been helpful to hear the thoughts of therapists on social media or in books, but I'm curious, like, what are some of the temptations that a therapist or coach may face as they're wanting to like put themselves out there and build their business, but they're also having to build and maintain social media platforms?
Mhm. I think one thing is that there are sort of strict requirements around in the therapy world what's called dual relationships. So, what I've seen some people do to try to navigate this is maybe they don't use Instagram to primarily get clients, right? That's not one of their main marketing tools. They state very clearly, like, this is not therapy, this is not a therapeutic relationship, or no DMs, right? I can't speak to any specific situation because that would get too close to providing therapy, right? I can be open about what resources are generally available. I can even be open about, here's information and education, but nothing is personal advice because that could be getting too close to a therapeutic relationship. I think for me, as someone who my training is primarily in narrative therapy as a specialty, and that is a type of therapy that's postmodern and considers power relationships really essentially in part of the work all the time. And as a therapist or counselor, you do have a position of power in people's lives. And I think that's something that needs to be regulated personally through, your own therapy, mentors, just sort of a well-grounded sense of self, because it really is easy to get very excited when something goes viral and you get a lot of followers or people really resonate with something you're saying. So for me, I always check, am I trying to give advice and tell people how they should live, or am I providing specialized information that I have because of not only my own experience, but because I've, spent $80,000 to get a
Hmm.
degree in clinical psychology, and I want the public to be more generally educated about these topics.
Yeah. So besides just a therapist's own kind of policing of their own motivations and standards and stuff, what are some of the ways the in the world of therapy that the system protects clients, either through like the AAMFT or state licensing boards? Like, what's the difference between those?
Yeah, AAMFT is a national professional organization. And then there are also state chapters. For example, I'm a member of the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. So there is a state board, which is actually a state agency in some structure of your state. And then there are professional organizations that say, sort of like, we will do the work of regulating our profession as well. And then the state licensing board is doesn't have to do as much, essentially. They will investigate things that are, legal complaints, but a state board is more likely to investigate or provide information about ethics complaints because every state agency and then or state organization, professional organization, and then the national professional organizations uphold kind of the standards of the field. So something that's legal, right? If you're breaking the law, for example, someone having an inappropriate intimate relationship with a client, that is against the law in every state. And that would be a legal complaint and something that could be pursued, through the legal complaint system at a state board. Someone providing a complaint about how someone is behaving in, say, a supervisor or supervisee relationship is more likely to be an ethical standard, and then that person would need to go to the board to resolve that complaint.
Okay. So, one thing I've noticed too is that, especially with the religious trauma therapists that I've listened to, some of them, like when you're dealing with religious trauma, a lot of times you're contrasting where people came from where they're at. And
Hmm.
so, and a lot of times where they came from is a very fundamentalist religious world. And so you're often distinguishing what healthy relationships look like from fundamentalist ones. And so I've heard religious trauma therapists sometimes criticize fundamentalist relationships, and they try to define it as like they're binary, they're black and white, they've got these boundaries and rules. But then it's like when you're trying to contrast that in minimizing those things, it almost feels like it blurs boundaries and it blurs things like consent.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how a religious trauma therapist's aversion to their fundamentalist past might cloud their judgment about things like boundaries or consent today and how they might try to handle some of those things.
Yeah, it's my perspective that we should never use anti-fundamentalism as an excuse to perpetuate harm or a lack of boundaries or excuse harmful behavior, right? I think that as humans, we do hurt each other, and how we resolve those hurts and how hurts have different characteristics based on who they're between, right? Are they between peers, right? If you and I were friends and there was a misunderstanding between us, that would be very different to resolve than if I was contracted to work for you on a project and we had a disagreement. Or if someone were to be in any sort of authority position over someone else, not just like perceived authority, but some sort of agreement. They were working together or, working on a project or an organization together. I think what's key about that is understanding the power differentials in a situation and then not taking general advice like, hey, step away from black and white thinking as anything that's automatically going to apply to any situation that we're going to talk about, right? Like if we have a
Hmm.
disagreement, there might be black and white thinking involved, but there might not be. And so I think in order to step away from that, we have to be able to see individual situations uh, as individual situations that require assessment and thoughtfulness and reflection rather than just saying, well, like every criticism of me is fundamentalist thinking. Like that's
Hmm.
just ridiculous. And that is kind of our perpetuation of the same system that many of us were involved in growing up.
Yeah, because I don't want to lose clarity and accountability either.
Right. Right. Yeah. And anytime someone is trying to excuse their behavior rather than be accountable for their behavior and acknowledge, like, even if this wasn't my intention, like clearly something happened and someone is upset, and it is worth dealing with that as a public figure in a way that um, honors the person who's hurt, right?
Hmm.
Like I don't think I'm such a good person that I could never hurt anyone that I work with or that I am in relationships with. And my goal is to like deal with my own disappointment in myself and then assess the situation and try to make things right with the person that's hurt rather than find a sort of any kind of theoretical way to dismiss the person that's hurt.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's say I'm ready to get therapy. I've come to the point where I'm like, okay, I'd like to talk to somebody, a professional about this. Are there any
Mhm.
places you would recommend for people to go in order to find well-vetted therapists?
Yes, again, acknowledging that there are limitations on people's finances or access to therapy based on their location. I want to offer a few options. And my goal is always that you find what works for you right now. There is no one type of therapy, there is no one therapist, there is no one book that can do trauma work for you, especially religious trauma, because so much of it is personal and requires the reflection and the personalization that no one can do for you. No one can walk your path for you or tell you how to do it. So the first is there is a directory. There are a couple directories of therapists who have said that they are, licensed therapists and counselors, and that they have some understanding of religious trauma and are willing to work with people on those concerns. The first is Reclamation Collective and reclamationcollective.org. They have both a directory of clinicians and they also offer low cost support groups that are led by therapists or clinicians, people with training, but they are not therapy groups. And therefore, those are accessible to people from any state or even any country. So those are two options. Another is Empathy Paradigm. There's a directory and some resources there that's led by another licensed professional who provides information about religious trauma and has a lot of resources on their website as well as a directory. So finding someone who's licensed in your state is getting easier and easier. Now, the next problem is the cost of therapy. Because religious trauma is sort of a small niche specialty, there are fewer providers, right? You are less likely to be able to go to, say, the Psychology Today directory in your area and find someone who specializes in religious trauma. So, for example, if you need to use insurance, I would at least find someone who's familiar with trauma and trained in trauma. And then I would ask them, because most professionals offer like a free 10 or 15-minute phone consultation to make sure it's a good fit. Ask them, do you have any experience with religious trauma or are you willing to learn and get consultation? The way that that person responds to that question will give you a good, idea of whether or not they might be a good therapist for you. The second option is to find out if there is a counselor or therapist training program in your area. Universities often have student clinics where you're getting someone who's currently in their program or maybe recently graduated who's doing supervised hours. Those are often much more affordable because you're paying a sliding scale rate. They're kind of university supported or community funded. And the thing that I like about that is you're getting people who have really current training, who have kind of the latest information about trauma and who might have a little bit more exposure to some of the nuances of trauma and religious trauma that people are talking about on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube, things like that. So check out and see if there's a student training clinic in your area because you're going to get somebody who's fresh and hopefully somebody who is really willing to learn, excited to research these things, and can bring in their other clinical skills. Because the impacts of trauma are the same. That's how we know it's trauma across different categories. So even if you get someone who maybe is saying, like, I'm, experienced in working in other types of trauma, but not this, you're likely to make progress with that person. Some of the challenges of working with religious trauma are that it can be very specific to a particular group that you are in. And I know it's exhausting as a client to explain some of the nuances of the church that you were raised in or the kind of theology that you were presented with. But it's worth doing that work with someone you trust. Like a good therapist is not going to be mostly just giving you advice and telling you how to live. A good therapist is not primarily going to be talking about themselves and what they did to heal in a similar scenario. And a good therapist is not going to make you do stuff that you don't want to do. We know from research of what creates effective therapy that a positive relationship with your therapist, meaning, do you like talking to this person and do you feel like they like you or are listening to you well? Super important, like the number one predictor of good outcomes in therapy. It is less important what specific training someone has or even their years of experience, interestingly, than some of the other factors in good outcomes in therapy. So, this is the first time you get to trust yourself. Do you like talking to this person as much as you know them so far? And could you see yourself telling them more about your story and what you've been through, the nuances of either your deconstruction or your deconversion, whatever you want to explain about your life and how to get help with the symptoms that are showing up in your life?
Well, that's really helpful. I know this world can be kind of intimidating to start to think through for a lot of non-professionals, especially when you have the weight of your trauma on top of you as well, and the whole money aspect too. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing some of your thoughts on helping us navigate some of this.
Absolutely. Happy to help.
Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Thursday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.